The role of next generation automated teller machines in disaster risk reduction. This presentation was given to the ATM Industry Association conference in New Orleans on the 9th of February 2023. It was given by me, a disaster management consultant, and also founder of the ATM Appreciation Society. Now, by next gen, I'm talking about an ATM that has cash recycling capability and seamlessly is capable of integrating digital transfers via, for example, mobile wallets into the physical currency and cash management space. And in terms of disaster risk reduction, well, interesting to note that the conference took place in New Orleans, which was badly affected by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. Many lessons learned from which, especially that to do with the role of cash in disaster management, went on to inform the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which the world is still working with today. Given that the world is creating risk faster than we're reducing it, the talk focused on three essential messages. The first, shown here, is that the ATM is not just a convenience. It's central to effective disaster risk reduction, and for a number of reasons which the rest of this talk will go through. The second is that not fully understanding the cash ecosystem or how cash is managed for societies in crisis. The ATM channel has always been underappreciated by the aid industry, who, under the Grand Bargain humanitarian reform process, came up with a series of commitments in 2016 which have always favoured the digital over the physical. And this is manifest particularly in a lobby group called the Better Than Cash Alliance, hosted by the UN. And the third is that ATMs don't just dispense cash, they dispense value. And it's this that we'll talk about more in a minute. But first, I want to share with you 5 stories about the utility of the ATM. The first concerns itself with the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2018. And I was working in Kinshasa at the time. And although you've got to bear in mind this was pre-COVID, one of the problems that was being faced by the Ministry of Health was that the laboratory technicians, brave people dealing with such a deadly bug, were threatening to go on strike because they hadn't been paid. So I said to the minister, I said, well, we can't really afford the laboratory to close down. Can you make sure that the technicians are paid? He said, yeah, no, of course. And they got paid. So when I went up to see them, they'd gone on strike. And I said, why are you striking? You got paid. This is what your problem was. And they said, well, we can't eat digital money. They've sent us to our mobile phones a digital transfer, and that's great. But what can we do with it? We need to convert it into cash. You can't use mobile money to buy things in the disaster affected area, which was the Ebola zone in northeastern Congo. So I relayed this back to the ministry, and he got the central bank to send up a dedicated cash recycling ATM for their exclusive use. And that way, laboratory technicians stopped striking, could afford to go to the market to buy food with real cash, which could later be recycled through this recycling ATM. This picture shows a recently refurbished ATM in Benghazi in Libya, actually in 2011, when Colonel Gaddafi was taken out. And it talks about being the most stable ATM because the ATM Appreciation Society has a list of over 100 extreme ATMs, and this is the world's most stable because at that stage in the history of Libya, we're talking about stabilization in terms of peace building, in terms of humanitarian inputs, and in terms of societal development. So here's an ATM which stabilized a seething society by providing cash, and not just any cash, but new cash that was without the face of their feared leader, Colonel Gaddafi. New money was brought in, flown in the middle of the night by the French and the British with the logistic support of the Americans. And this new money calmed tensions between warring groups, tribes even, in Benghazi. So an ATM and cash created political stabilization. Didn't last long, sadly. And the third story is about the world's most humanitarian ATM. So a fleet of mobile ATMs in the then largest refugee camp in the world, Zaatari, in Jordan, where inflation particularly was curbed by bringing in cash management services through these mobile ATMs. And because cash could be recycled, inflationary pressures in the camp were brought under control. People who were setting up shop could deposit their cash and their takings at the end of the day. Otherwise, there was nowhere else to safely deposit their money. And interestingly, you can probably just see that these ATMs dealing with a largely illiterate population used iris recognition rather as a form of biometric authentication rather than a PIN pad. To the north of Syria, Syrian refugees in Turkey were being socially protected through monthly payments to Kizilay cards. This is Turkish Red Cross Red Crescent debit card run through the state-owned bank, Halk Bank. And what's important to note about this in terms of commercial use cases is that 1.8 million people were given these cards, over 10% of whom went on to become entrepreneurs and successful business people, because the wider population, the wider public, often doesn't see refugees anything other than being pathetic, helpless victims, but they're not. Many put down roots and begin trading near their former homes. And when a bank is able to capture such a large customer base through the goodwill of, in this case, the Red Crescent, they have just saved themselves the cost of customer acquisition, which any student of banking will know is the major expense in terms of marketing and account maintenance, and probably saved the bank in the order of $150 to $200 per person per year. So you could argue that the Red Cross and the UN between them had more or less subsidized that bank to the tune of $80 to $100 million per year. And the fifth story just flips back to Amman in Jordan, where the bank concerned, working with, in this case, UNHCR for 12 years, over a period 2017 to 21, the client bank, Cairo Amman Bank, in terms of revenue, rose from 11th to 4th in the country. Similar to Turkey, the UN had given this bank a wide customer base, from which they not only can grow their business, but establish their forward planning in terms of projected lifetime revenue. I said at the beginning that ATMs don't just dispense cash, they dispense value. And these are the four areas of social value that we're talking about. The first refers to the fostering of resilience. What can cash actually do prior to and after the onset of disaster? Second is that cash accelerates recovery. That is in terms of early recovery and later reconstruction. That it promotes social and societal and financial inclusion and reduces poverty. The second area is that cash fosters resilience. We talked about that a bit earlier. The resilience of cash, the ability to work when systems are down and to be relied upon, to be trusted. The resilience in times of crisis means maintaining access to cash must now be a central plank in any disaster risk management strategy. And the ATM plays a pivotal role in this, because in disaster situations, reliable, efficient, secure, convenient, and timely payment solutions need to be provided to all those affected if they are able to purchase what they need to the priorities that they set themselves rather than what international aid agencies set for them. So access to cash is crucial. Important to note that however money is sent to survivors of disaster, refugees and other, and I showed you earlier the Kizilay card, debit card used in Turkey, is that all over the world, time and time again, results show that beneficiaries, the recipients of these cash stipends, cash out the full amount at the earliest possible opportunity. And there are lots of reasons for this to do with income multiplier effects and what have you, which I'll come on to. But they can't cash out if they don't have access to it. So the two things go hand in hand. And lastly, just to mention that the communications of risk goes hand in hand with this building of resilience. Let me just show you a couple of examples of what I mean. This ATM in Kathmandu in Nepal, just after the earthquake in 2017, which I call the world's best built ATM, but basically you can see this real-time picture which I took, shows that you have to watch a 30-second video about how to build seismic resistance back into your building when you start reconstruction. You have to watch it before you can get access to your cash. And the second example of risk communications concerns the COVID crisis. Actually, this particular one is in Israel, but I call it the world's cleanest ATM because it's being fogged to prevent disease transmission. And there's a sideline about this because there is no evidence that ATMs, or money for that matter, play any significant role in transmission of infectious diseases. But the point is that the ATM industry, working with the World Health Organization, put out a global series of public health messages, which, just like the Build Back Better one you saw just now from Nepal, told people who were trying to withdraw cash what they had to do in terms of social distancing and washing their hands and what have you. So a useful public health message role, which the ATM played for COVID, played incidentally also for Ebola, and will play again next time there is an epidemic or pandemic. The next social benefit of the next gen ATM is that it maintains liquidity, it maintains the circulation of cash in local economies. And this has major benefits for merchants and for cash users. I mean, for a start, it increases in-store traffic, allows for more predictable cash flow, but importantly, it reduces cash handling costs. It also stimulates local multiplier effects. And again, the emphasis is on local. 2.7, it's been estimated that 2.7 times the value of the face value of cash circulating in a local area is generated when you use cash rather than when you use digital forms of payment. Not only do you have this 2.7 multiplier effect, but it stays local and adds value locally. And finally, in terms of accelerating recovery and the societal benefit, there is a reduction in fiduciary risk to the donor, to the user, and to the merchant through a next-gen ATM, reducing the possibility of fraud and theft. The third social value I want to talk about, I'm going to be quite generic about this in terms of the drop-down list, which I'll show you now, is that a cashless society would almost certainly deepen fragile social divisions between rich and poor, have and have-nots, between the banked and the unbanked, and just exacerbate the digital divide. So there will always be a social price to pay when society attempts to go cashless. You can see that in India and Nigeria today. To point out that it could be seen as a human right that everyone should have freedom, everyone, including especially women, to decide their own priorities and choose their own financial solutions. So cash transfers provide choice and dignity. They link up, as we saw with the Red Cross Kızılay card in Turkey, link up with social protection mechanisms, providing all sorts of economies of scale for government. They protect the user, the customer, from political interference, where governments can switch off payments mechanisms at will if they are solely electronic. But more importantly, perhaps, this idea that cash promotes equity between different groups of people, particularly marginalized groups, for example, who don't get left out, as some people would deliberately like to do when using cash. And that cash, when women are included, are become an important part of the social cohesion, the social fabric of society, in areas where hitherto they might not have been. And where we see cash being used in Southeast Asia, for example, bank accounts being held by women are increasing at a far more rapid rate than by men. So this overall promotion of social inclusion is a massively important benefit of the ATM channel. And the final area where ATMs add social value is in poverty reduction. ATMs play an increasingly important role in enabling financial inclusion, which I've mentioned earlier, and thereby reducing poverty. Financial inclusion is seen by the World Bank and others as one of the most efficient and effective ways of sustainably reducing poverty, especially in remote rural areas. But the real area that the ATM adds unseen value is in realizing that non-physical, digital transfers, especially in times of crisis, can very quickly build up a level of individual and household indebtedness that impacts negatively on people's credit ratings and their ability to generate loans later. This really matters if you're a poor farmer in East Africa, for example. So the unseen role of the ATM plays in reducing financial indebtedness is massively important, thoroughly misunderstood, and leads to the ATM being underappreciated. And finally, the fact that the machine, especially a next generation ATM, can provide real-time interaction with either bots or human tellers far away can play a really important role in enhancing financial and digital literacy to the benefit of all concerned. So what does all this mean for the financial service provider and the ATM deployer? Well, I hope I've demonstrated that the ATM channel provides an opportunity, and especially an ESG opportunity, environment, social and governance opportunity, based on expanded social utility for those who are dispossessed and disaffected around the world, which is nearly half of the world's adult population, whether they have bank accounts or not. The next generation ATM in particular has the potential to be a game changer for the aid industry and for those it serves. The first is that it is capable of dispensing and redeeming vouchers. Now, cash is by definition unconditional. You can spend it on anything. And refugees and others who get cash as part of a humanitarian package, they do not waste it. And that's why it is now the default response option. But sometimes vouchers, which are conditional on certain behaviors or on the purchase of certain goods, are used. And if vouchers go to a trader and cannot be redeemed for cash, there's not much incentive for the trader to use them. If the trader can go to an ATM at the end of the working day and redeem his or her vouchers there and then, that would be a wonderful thing. Of course, the voucher would have to be printed more or less to the same standard as a banknote, and it could only be possible to cash out, which is effectively what you're doing, what the merchant would be doing if you have a highly protected password. The second is that the recycling facility of an ATM keeps cash circulating in society, thereby accelerating all the benefits we were talking about earlier. The benefits of local multiplier effects. I talked just now about financial literacy. If you have a twin screen, financial literacy is going to be enhanced, because you'll be able to talk to somebody and be able to have a second, not just the transaction screen, but something and someone else talking to you about other aspects of the transaction, including in real time. And you can do this by audio and or by video, but only if you have a twin screen, one of which should nowadays be a touch screen. So communicate with one screen and transact with another. Embed biometrics, could be anything from the way you walk to the way you talk, the way you interact with the machine, the behavioral biometrics to the more physical ones, of course, like thumbprints and palm veins, and as we saw in Jordan, the iris scanning. I talked earlier about the touchscreen. This is important, especially for those who are illiterate, and there are parts of the world where ATM deployers dispense with the PIN pad altogether and use instead symbols and colors, which they move at random around the screen, and the user, the customer, just has to hit the touch screen rather than the PIN pad. It works, it's very successful, it's not difficult to do. And finally, the physical movement of money and cash in transit, which the aid world in particular has really not grappled properly with. Intelligent banknote destruction systems to do with glue fusion or with ink staining is a safe way to ensure that your money doesn't get abused or stolen, but only if you use a cash cassette. ATMs are replenished with cash cassettes, so why doesn't the aid world move its cash around with cassettes? And finally, if you're an ATM deployer, what can you do? Well, you can test bed in a refugee camp the deployment of a next generation ATM and prove, both yourselves, to your partners and to future customers and aid agencies, how a next gen ATM can add value to humanitarian affairs worldwide, especially in closed loop systems like refugee camps. Develop the user interface so that people who are less literate, less good with numbers, can still access cash. In conjunction, I talked about twin screens, supporting financial literacy programs, both in front of the ATM and in the classroom. Just provide general cash management know-how, how the cash ecosystem actually works, because that will help everybody use the same language, work more consistently with central banks, etc. And engage at central level in policy and strategy development with the Cash Learning Partnership, and support collective advocacy. Now, I'd say this is not well done by the ATM industry, but it has been shown in the last few years anyway that this might be best done through a think tank such as Cash Essentials. So that's it. I've run through the four major areas where the ATM, especially the next generation ATM, can add social value. If anybody's looking for another reason to engage, then you can always sponsor the ATM Appreciation Society, because as this photograph shows, ATMs are needed in disaster zones all over the world, wherever, whenever, and one day it'll be you. Thank you and goodbye. This is James Shepherd-Barron signing off.